Hi, I'm Alexandra Carter, and there were a few things that stood out to me during this week's reading. One quote that really stuck out was from the case of Cora in chapter 9 of our textbook. And Cora was a counselor, and her secretary actually confided personal information to her during a time of distress. So Cora was then faced with an ethical dilemma when the situation affected the secretary's performance at work. And it did state in the textbook that Cora's professional responsibility to avoid misusing her power and to ensure that the more vulnerable individual in the relationship is not harmed. And that's straight from the textbook. And in this case, I think that Cora was in a position of power and her secretary was the more vulnerable one of the two. I think that it's really interesting that the counseling field has those guidelines because while it seems like it's an obvious thing to do, not everyone is going to work to protect the vulnerable person in a situation. This case also made me think about the importance of keeping personal relationships and counseling relationships separate. And the authors of our textbooks actually made it really clear that counselors should not be providing services to their friends or family members. And while counselors are obviously people too and can have friends who confide in them, it's important to remind that person to that you're listening to, that you're just listening as a friend and not as a professional. And it's also important to refer that person to another counselor who can provide unbiased services. Another point that stood out to me is that counselors are discouraged from engaging in dual relationships, except when it can benefit the client. So I would imagine that that's a really difficult thing to prove because how can one actually prove that it's going to benefit the client? I understand that there are sometimes extenuating circumstances, but it seems like that decision would be really difficult to make. So that is what stood out to me this week. Thank you so much for listening.